This is MasteryCast. U.S. History Lesson 19. The topic is the Vietnam War and the 60s. Our discussion of the Vietnam War begins with President Eisenhower's domino theory. This was his theory about containment. He compared countries on the brink of communism to a row of dominoes. If one falls, all would fall. This was his warning to the Western world. President Johnson was blamed for escalation of the war in Vietnam. In the early stages of the war, however, America was in favor of the effort. In 1964, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was passed by Congress. This gave the president broad authority and military power in Vietnam. The battles begin in 1965, most notably Operation Rolling Thunder, where North Vietnam was bombed. The Vietnam War contributed to President Johnson's decision not to run for a second term as a result of our lack of success and its growing unpopularity. The United States had some military advantages, specifically superior weaponry. However, the Viet Cong also had some advantages. This was a guerrilla war. With their knowledge of jungle terrain and their ability to blend in with civilians, in many instances they had an advantage. They were also willing to pay any price for victory. The U.S. military strategy included bombing and the use of napalm and Agent Orange. Viet Cong military strategies included hit-and-run ambushes, the use of landmines and booby traps, as well as surprise attacks, overall guerrilla warfare. Also the use of tunnels. The lack of success in Vietnam led to a credibility gap, as the cost of the Vietnam War, both in casualties and dollars, eroded many of President Johnson's Great Society programs. The country began to protest. TV brought the war home. Protests and efforts to avoid the war resulted. 1968 would be a key year. We had the Tet Offensive. This was the Viet Cong's advancement into the cities, which took the American forces almost a month to stop. This told the Americans that the war was not over. Secondly, we saw the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King and, shortly thereafter, Robert Kennedy, who was at that point a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president. Also, the disorder at the Democratic National Convention would show the dissatisfaction of the country with the Democratic Party, ultimately leading to the success of Republican candidate Richard Nixon in his bid for the White House. President Nixon's policy of handing over the war to South Vietnam was referred to as Vietnamization. President Nixon campaigned on a policy of peace with honor. However, his invasion into Cambodia began to worry many Americans. We saw an increased protest and general response from Congress in passing the War Powers Act. This basically required the president and continues to require the president to give Congress notice of military action. The War Powers Act and the revocation of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution were Congress's message to the president, a protest to the Cambodia invasion and potential escalation of the war in Vietnam. Ultimately, the results of the Vietnam War included the failure of containment, and many Americans lost faith in their government. This is happening during the 60s, and we've already discussed the civil rights movement which took place in the 60s. Many other minority groups basically piggybacked on the efforts of the civil rights movement. We saw the Latino movement beginning. Cesar Chavez unionized farmers and forming the United Farm Workers. Also, Bilingual Education Act required Spanish-speaking students to receive some additional assistance in school. Native American groups also moved forward. We saw the American Indian movement begin. This was a movement towards self-determination and an end to the termination program. Some legislative results: the Indian Education Act. The women's movement also moved forward. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique. The National Organization for Women was formed. Gloria Steinem and Ms. Magazine, and ultimately the discussion of a potential Equal Rights Amendment. Title VII, the Equal Pay or Equal Opportunity Act, was passed, which provides that employers may not discriminate in the workplace on the basis of sex, race, or religion. Also in 1973, we saw the landmark Supreme Court decision legalizing abortion in Roe v. Wade. Also remember that our Supreme Court decisions in the area of rights of the accused also took place in the 60s, reflective of our liberal society. Ultimately, the 60s resulted in a change in culture from the 50s. The 60s were anti-establishment and advocating nonconformity. We saw changes in art, music, and fashion, a much more casual approach to social behavior, a high divorce rate. The ultimate result will be a conservative backlash. After the 60s, we will see a series of conservative presidents as our nation reacts to this turbulent period. This concludes this Mastery Cast on the Vietnam War and the 60s. Remember, return to www.masterymaze.com for more review podcasts like this one in your school subjects.